I'm going to introduce our next speaker while everybody is getting their coffee and coming back to their seats. Our next speaker is Gabriel Velez, a Ph.D. student in comparative human development here at the University of Chicago. His research focuses on adolescent development and the formation of ideas about citizenship, human rights, and peace amid conflict and post-conflict contexts. He is interested in supporting understandings of how diverse group of youth process and respond to their experiences as members of society as they begin to think of themselves as citizens and community members. He developed his interest while teaching high school for 6 years in Harlem, Tacna, Peru, and Bogota, Colombia. He graduated from Harvard University in 2007 with a degree in history and literature. Welcome, Gabriel.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you all for being here, for waiting out a longer day. I see we have at least one Cubs fan in the audience, and I'm sure there are a couple others, so also choosing the conference over the parade was tough. I know, yep, but with modern technology and access to videos, you can pretty much probably live it later tonight in the comfort of your home rather than with millions of people out on the street. So I think in the end, maybe a good choice. All right, so to begin, I got a great introduction there, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about myself. As was mentioned, I was a teacher before I entered my current PhD program, and I taught in Harlem for 1.5 years, and then I taught in Peru as a volunteer for 2 years, and then I was in Bogota, Colombia for 3. And after all this time as a teacher, I had some ideas that I really wanted to kind of explore and develop more. I, as Heidi, really think that youth are an incredible age group to work with, particularly adolescents. I think how they're coming to understand their country, their role in it, themselves as citizens, human rights, are fascinating areas and areas that really have a huge impact on what countries look like in the future. And so with that in mind, I came into my PhD program where I focus on that. I focus on pretty much figuring out what youth are thinking and talking to them, because often their voice is left out. Even when people know that they're important in these programs and practices and ideas, they don't actually go and talk to youth and understand what's kind of going on in their heads. So to start, I wanted to also present some of the objectives that I'm hoping to kind of give here today. You all come from classroom settings that you know much better than I do. You're all here and to kind of gain some resources and ideas. So first, I wanted to talk a little bit, not about my own work, but about the Colombian context, because I think for a couple reasons it's a very interesting context, and I'm hoping to kind of explain a little bit about that. Then I wanted to provide you with some concrete examples of how peace in particular, but also human rights, are being taught in Colombia, and that's kind of the intersection of my work. And then I wanted to kind of end with a little bit of time to give you a chance to talk amongst yourselves and then also maybe share and start thinking about concrete ideas that you could maybe take away or things that could be adapted to your classrooms, because again, all of you know those much better than we do, and we're here to provide the resources, but I wanted to give you some space before you go home and relax and enjoy your weekend to maybe come away with some concrete takeaways. So as I mentioned, I wanted to start with talking about Colombia, and as a kind of a disclaimer, I am half Colombian. My father was born in Colombia, but I grew up here in the States. I was born here. I speak Spanish still with an accent to this day because my parents never spoke to me. So it's always been a place that's fascinated me and grabbed my attention and interest. But it also, I think, is fascinating for other reasons. I mean, it's a country of 47 million people, so it's a little less than a sixth the population of the United States. It's at the northern tip of South America there, so borders the Pacific, it also borders the Caribbean. It has a lot of economic connections to the United States, but it also has this long history of conflict, right? This goes back hundreds of years. It's something that has really marked the society and marked its history. And the most recent conflict began in the 1950s and 60s, and it really was set off by a presidential candidate being murdered, which led to riots in the streets, led to a period that was called the violence. And out of that sort of emerged some revolutionary groups that essentially took up arms and took to the hills and fought the government because they didn't feel that there was space in the government to really express their political ideas. A lot of them were very young at the time too. And this has led to over 5 decades of warfare. Now, that's kind of the beginning of it, but it has also emerged into a really complex web that involves drugs, it involves gangs, it involves anti-communist paramilitaries, illegal mining, just an incredible array of factors and complications. And it's a real serious issue that Colombian society has tried to deal with. They've had 3 or 4 peace processes to try and end these conflicts, and even today they're in the middle of another one, which was briefly mentioned earlier, and I'll get to in a little bit a second to provide some more detail. But first, to give you some more idea of this kind of history, over these 5 decades of internal warfare, there have been 220,000 people killed, and this is out of kind of an official report that was done. There have been over 6 million displaced, so that's about 1 in 8 Colombians have been displaced from where they lived or their land because of the violence in some way. And then another 27,000 kidnapped. And this kidnapping is both urban and rural, and just about 15 years ago, it was something that really plagued the society deeply. Now, starting off with all that pessimism in the past and in the history, there's a real moment of optimism that's been going on in the last couple of years in Colombia, and this has to do with this peace treaty. So some of you may have seen it. It's come up in the last couple months in the news, especially in the New York Times often. I feel like there's someone at the New York Times who really values this, and I appreciate that, because they've run a number of articles on it. But basically, the government, over the last 4 years, sat down with one of the revolutionary groups, one of these Marxist kind of communist groups that's out. They're an armed group that's in the hills, essentially fighting the government. And for 4 years, they've worked out peace accords. And this has been a difficult process. During these 4 years, people have been killed on both sides. During these 4 years, there's been a lot of push back and forth. There have been a lot of touchy issues. But they finally, this past summer, agreed to some peace accords, and they sat down and they signed them. And they were 297 pages long, so they are quite a tome. And even though they were agreed to and signed by both sides, the president decided that there would have to be a referendum. And he really pushed this from the beginning. He decided the people would vote on this. It would be up to the people. Now, as kind of an interesting side point, there was talk about whether this meant people above 18 or whether this meant people above 14. And in the end, it ended up being people above 18, which I think was a very interesting choice because unlike an election where a president or a congressman will cycle through every 4 or 6 years, these are peace accords that essentially are setting the map for the country indefinitely into the future. So a 15-year-old will be 20, 30 when a lot of these things are finally taking place and finally leading, well, hopefully leading to really positive outcomes. But anyway, so on the side, here's a photo of the president with the head of this group, which is called the FARC, which in English translates to the Armed Revolutionary Forces of Colombia. Here's a picture of one of the plazas in Bogota on the day that they signed those accords. There's a lot of smiles, as you can see, a lot of positive feeling. Now, as has kind of been mentioned before, in the end, the Colombian people voted no. In the map, you can see that it was sort of very divided. So the orange part there are the regions of the country where they voted no, and the green part are the regions where they voted yes, or sort of the majority of people did. That little green sliver in the middle is where Bogota is, so that's where the capital is. So that voted very differently than the rest of the center. But you can see it was a very divisive kind of issue. And then I love this, and I kept it in Spanish and pulled it right out of this news source, because on top you have the yes vote, on the bottom you have the no. The no won with 50.21%. So it came down to about 50,000 votes in an election where about 13 million voted. All right, so it was an incredibly small difference. Now, the other thing you'll notice is how small both of these bars are. In total, about 13% of the population voted. Or sorry, 13% of the electorate. So 13% of the people who could vote, voted. All right, and this is an issue. This is a peace accord again. It's ending 5 decades of warfare. It's been all in the news. And there are many reasons for that, and I don't want to go into that. I could give you probably a 40-minute talk on that, and I'd be happy to talk more about it after for anyone who's curious. But it just gives you a sense, I think, of the context now that's going on in Colombia. So during this, I was actually there this past summer, and my work that I was doing was I was going out and interviewing youth in the capital, and I was asking them what they think about peace, how they're learning about peace, what human rights means to them, and trying to get a sense of how they were processing what was going on, all of this, for themselves as individuals. Oops. And so to get into this, I kind of want to take a step back and explain 2 of the schools that I was working in, give you a little bit of sense of these 2 schools. Because there has been a particular focus on youth as part of this peace process. But there are a lot of really interesting challenges that are both very particular to Colombia, but I think also we'll kind of make a lot of connections to our own country here in the United States. So to start, this is one of the schools. It's called Colegio Almendra, and it's a school in the north of Bogota. It's a private elite school. Its students come from parents who are big business owners. Some of them work in high levels of the government. And these students, in many ways, live a very sheltered life. Because of the history of violence in Colombia, they'll often leave home and they'll go in a school bus to school, which is this beautiful gated campus. Then they will be taken in the school bus to their private club. There they might be picked up by a car with a personal driver, which sometimes may even be an armored car, and then shuttled back home, right? And so they live lives that they're not unaware of the conflict. The school teaches about peace. It teaches about Colombian history. Some of them have relatives who have had land that's been taken from them or been kidnapped. But they do live in kind of this relative isolation and relative protection from a lot of the conflict that's going on, and then also a lot of the violence that happens in cities that's tied to drugs and gangs. The second school is Colegio Gaitan, and this is all the way in the south of Bogota. And in this school, these students, they come often from other regions of the country, and their families have had to move to Bogota. They've had to essentially create their homes for themselves. They've created new areas of the city, and then slowly after a few years, the government will come in and give them electricity. And then slowly after a few years, they'll put in running water. And then slowly after a few years, they'll put in a paved road. And this is a few pictures of what that kind of looks like, that neighborhood in that area. And then their parents often will really be scraping by, selling 15-cent meat empanadas on the street, or possibly roving the streets at night, going through garbage and recycling for valuable materials that they can then resell. And as I mentioned before, I think in many ways this is reflective of Colombia, but also reflective of a lot of issues in the world at large. And so here, the star in the bottom left is Colegio Gaitan, and on the upper right is Colegio Almendra. And these two schools are in the same city, right? They're in the same country. They're all Colombians. But these are really entirely different worlds. You know, we all live here in Chicago, and I often make these connections as well, but it is something that's very particular to Colombia too. It has a very strong history of being divided by class, being divided by geography. And I think often when we talk about peace education or human rights education, especially in contexts like this, we're not as attentive to the diversity then of these actual students. So the challenge in Colombia is if we're going to teach about peace, if we're going to try and lay the groundwork with these youth for a better future, how are we going to connect with these youth, but also with these youth, right? And all of those who are in between and have wildly different experiences also. That is, I think, doubly important because there are ideas that are out there in society that youth draw from, right? So when we don't teach about education peace and human rights, I think youth are like sponges. You know, all of you who work with, children from very young ages to 18, they pick up things that are there in society. And in Colombian society, this is a history that's marked by drugs and violence. And these youth are very much aware of it. When you talk to them, whether or not they've ever met someone who's from the United States or from another country, they'll say, we Colombians are known for Pablo Escobar, or we're known for being drug addicts. And that's something that they're marked by, and they feel that. And they're responding to that each in their own kind of individual ways. But I think it's important that education provide a space to help them respond to that and to change that narrative. And one of the fascinating things about Colombia is that there's been a movement to start doing that. There's been a real intentional effort. And so the government in 2015 signed into law a peace education law. And essentially what this did was it mandated that in all schools and universities in Colombia, they teach about peace. I think that's a great first step. It's something that the country really needs, and it has sparked a lot of conversation and a lot of really interesting things around how do we teach about peace, how do we teach about history, how do we teach about human rights. Now, to give you kind of a general overview of the law, it involves 12 themes, and each school is supposed to select 2 and then be able to show to the government somehow how they're kind of hitting those 2 themes in their curriculum. These themes include justice and human rights, historic memory, sustainable use of natural resources, and then kind of a list that goes on and on and on. And when you see the whole list there, and I'm not going to go through every one, but you can see it's an extensive list, right? I mean, if I handed you these 12 things and said, teach about these 12, I mean, you could pick two things that are radically different, and you could be teaching about them. And you could be in one school, and then you could be in the other, and this kind of fulfillment of the peace education law could look nothing like each other. And in fact, this has kind of been the case. With these sort of 12 themes and with this law, it sort of led to both a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities in the Colombian context. And so here I kind of lay out some of these, and I think they're really interesting. The first challenge here is that Colombia historically has a decentralized school system. So unlike we have here in the United States, Colombia will put into education, or sort of into law, certain things about education, and it will be entirely up to the schools how they actually implement that. There's no sort of national curriculum. There's some national tests that they have to take, but there's very little kind of direct involvement at a broader level on what these schools are doing. So what that allows for, it does create the opportunity, though, of there being real space for teachers and educators in their schools to be creative and to develop things that are locally relevant. The second challenge is, like I mentioned, there are 12 themes there, and they're very extensive. So it's really wide-ranging, and that can leave you a little lost as an educator. It also, though, allows for the development of things that are really transversal. So you can be doing something in a school that's touching on mathematics, that's involving something in gym class, that really goes kind of across the board. Next, this being a law and being tied to the president, who I mentioned before, it's very political, too. And that does create some problems because the issue of this peace process is very divisive in Colombian society. And so there's some ways that it creates hurdles just because of who it's attached to and who's pushing it in the political sphere. On the other hand, I think that that's in some ways an opportunity because then it's very much tied to things that are important and salient in the country right now. Lastly, as I mentioned before, there's this diversity of experiences with conflict. So if you're going to teach about memory, you're going to have to teach about it in ways that are going to be very attentive to who your students are. If your students lost parents because the government in some attack killed them, that's going to be something very different than if you're teaching students who have had no direct experience or have never kind of had family members touched by the conflict. So lastly, I think this kind of leads to this grand challenge of how to implement it. The government said, here's a peace law, you got to do it, here are 12 themes, go. And it's in some ways an opportunity because what it's done is there are so many educators, there's so many organizations, there's so many people in Colombia who are working on peace education and human rights education because it's almost like kind of a laboratory where you have thousands of schools who need to do something and a lot of them don't know what to do. And so there's this real great space and opportunity to develop it. So with that in mind, I want to kind of go through there are really 3 examples of a couple things that they're doing in schools. And again, this is just to kind of show you some of the ways that these schools are handling this challenge. And some of them are resources you may be able to draw from. Some of them are, I just think, kind of interesting ways that this is working out in Colombia. The first comes from the Anne Frank House. So this is an international example. And they're drawing on it and really adapting it in some of these schools in Colombia. And it's something called the fair play game. And in the resources that are in your folder for my talk, I have listed there the link and all the information so you can get it if you want later. And this game, this activity really targets the kind of the theme of prevention of school bullying and diversity. Here's a snapshot from what it looks like, but it's an online game, so it's an interactive kind of online game there that youth can go and they can log on to. And basically it's an educational game where 6 young football players are scouted for a football academy. And so as players have to make these decisions and have to kind of interact with these different players, they have to deal with situations that are related to discrimination, prejudices, group pressure. From the website, from the Anne Frank House website, they say, fair play, this game, confronts young people with anti-Semitism, homophobia, and discrimination. The players need to find a way to deal with the discrimination by others, as well as to come to terms with their own prejudices. They choose one of 3 roles: perpetrator, bystander, or helper. And so the idea is they kind of go through this process like you would in any sort of almost sports video game, making your decisions, who you're going to pick, who's going to be the captain. And then there's an element at the end that's reflective. And so they're asked to kind of think about what role did you take, what was the effect of your contributions, how would you handle it differently if you could. I think this is a great resource in some ways because, first of all, soccer is one of those things in South America, and particularly in Colombia, really draws in kids like that, almost across the board. You know, it's their favorite national sport. It's something that so many people play, and so they really connect with that. It's also online and, you know, through technology that the youth are really in touch with and love using. So anytime they get to log in and play something online, you know, they get excited about, as I'm sure many of you have experienced with your students. And then lastly, it kind of models this fair play and these sort of real-world situations. So without necessarily having to sit down and talk about something that's directly going on in the classroom yet, you can first approach it sort of indirectly through something like this. Now, the second example that I want to offer is from the Ministry of Education. So even though the Ministry of Education has this peace education law and essentially tells schools, go do what you want to do, they have offered a few kind of lesson plans here and there to provide schools with some ideas of what they could do. And so some schools are drawing directly from these ideas in these lessons. The nice thing about these, and I'm going to show you one that's here from the 9th grade, a sample lesson plan, is that they offer kind of the theoretical background, so the teachers are sort of understanding why they're doing this activity, and then they lay out very clearly the activity with the resources like worksheets or whatever that you would need to be able to do it. So here's kind of a simple one, and it starts with this kind of like theoretical background for the teacher. And it gives you this little kind of matrix here, where on the bottom you have personal interest, so how much you're acting in kind of your own interests of yourself. And then along this one, which is kind of hard to read, it's how much you're thinking about relationships with others. And the idea is they've broke it up into 4 quadrants, and these are ways that you could respond to a situation of conflict or tension with a classmate or with a friend or someone in your family. And so if you're acting with kind of low personal interest, but also a low concern for relationships, they label that evading. You're kind of evading the situation and the conflict. If you're acting with low personal interest and a high concern for the relationships, that's like giving in. In the upper right, you're compromising, so that would be a high personal interest, but also a high awareness of the needs and wants of the other person. And then if you're kind of just focused on your own personal interests, that would be imposing. Now, as you see this, one little caveat is I translated this from Spanish, so if you have an issue too with some of the words or you're kind of questioning that, it's probably my kind of translation. So, you know, it's obviously not perfect, and there are many other ways you could respond, but this kind of lays out a theoretical framework for the activity to kind of think through it. Then the activity in some ways is very basic. It presents a little story that you would share with your students. So the story is Zoraida and Milton have been going out for a few months. Milton's family is very close, and because of this, his parents organized a party with all of his aunts, uncles, and cousins to celebrate his birthday. In the middle of the party, Milton is excited and wants Zoraida to dance with him. She doesn't want to because she's embarrassed to do it in front of all of his family. So it's a situation of kind of tension or conflict, and one that could come up in an adolescent's life. Then you kind of, in groups, you have the students answer it with a response that would be each one of these 4 ways. So one would be giving in, that Zoraida somehow gives in to the wants of Milton. One would be evading. One would be compromising, and one would be imposing. And so this really works through skills of perspective taking, conflict resolution, and as I mentioned, it's kind of a way that teachers who might feel lost with that peace education law and all those themes can kind of concretely develop a lesson that they could use with their students. The third one is really sort of a group of a couple different activities, and honestly, this is something that they use in a lot of these schools with low resources where they don't even have organizations that are as wonderful as the one we just heard about. And so they're kind of developing artistic ways of working with youth around peace and human rights that are very kind of basic. But I think that they're also very telling. And many of them actually, I was seeing the connection to the presentation we just saw and some of the great activities that Artworks is doing as well. And so these kind of 3 examples of these activities are, first one is developing a personal timeline. So, you know, giving students a big sheet of paper and having them just map out their own personal history. Right? I mean, it's not very often that youth are really asked, well, what's your life? Tell me the story of your life. Tell me who you are, where you come from. And so, and really to have a chance to develop it and think about it, and then present it to others. That could be presentation at a school level, that could be presentation to a classroom, to just a classmate. But that's sort of one. And then a second one is a body map. You know, another very simple activity, but big sheet of paper, You sketch out their body, or you have them trace it, and then they sort of basically decorate it with things that talk about their own identity, or things they have experienced, or things that they're feeling and how that's connected to their body. And so it's really, again, connecting them and giving them a sense of agency and letting them talk about who they are and who they are in relation to some of these things, their society, the conflict they may face. As a last one, and this was actually one of the activities just in a different form that Artworks does, is a community map, right? And I think it's wonderful to do it with the photography and actually, you know, I've seen it done in that way sometimes, and it's incredibly impressive. But you could also just do it by handing them paper and some markers, you know, and have them describe the areas of their country, their city, their neighborhood. And again, this gives them a real sense of power and agency, I think. You know, often they're shown maps, or we teach about geography, and it's seen as kind of this objective, external way of framing it. But this allows them to create, well, no, this part of my neighborhood is important to me because this is where I always go to play with my friends. Or this is a park where I can't go because it's really dangerous, and there are drugs, and there are gangs, and whatever it is. And they really can shape their space and start to understand a little bit more how they're interacting with that space. So I think we will have time. It may be kind of a little shortened, sort of 5 minutes, but I wanted to end with kind of a classic teacher activity, right, of a think, pair, share. I know you've had a number of talks today. I know you've had informal spaces over coffee, over the wonderful lunch, to talk about some of what you've seen. But I wanted to sort of give you 5 minutes here at your table. First, to introduce yourselves if you haven't. And then secondly, to think about these two questions in relation both to what I've just talked about in this last half an hour, but also maybe what you've seen throughout the course of the day. And the two questions are, first, just sort of what connections can you draw to your own classrooms and education here in the United States or even here in Chicago? So what are you thinking about right now in terms of your own classroom that you know better than anyone else here? Or your own educational context if you're not a teacher. And then secondly, maybe more generally, so what are you thinking about? Like, what is all this kind of discussion today? What sort of juices are flowing in your mind? You know, I think it's always wonderful to share with other people. And I think it's also late in the afternoon, so it's a great opportunity to start sort of processing that before we check out for the weekend. So, like I said, I'll give you 5 minutes if you want to take a second to sort of think about it yourself, but then please share in your groups, and I'll ask some people to share with the whole group when we come back together at, we'll say, like 2:05. All right, so why don't we, I know that was very, very brief, but I'm kind of excited to hear about what some of these thoughts and ideas are. Honestly, this is the part of my talk I was looking forward to most. I miss being in the classroom. I miss kind of the things that you think about as a teacher, now being a PhD student. So I'm very curious to hear some of what you were thinking about. So do we have anyone who wants to be brave and share whatever they were just discussing in their pair or in their table? All right, we got a brave one in the back. Mm-hmm.
So, because I lived in Miami for 15 years, I knew about a lot of the South American countries. And so I was aware, and I had Colombian friends, so I was aware of the disparities in educational opportunities for wealthy Colombians versus poor Colombians. And obviously, as FARC became more powerful, that determined a lot of people's educational outcomes, going for many for decades. And so I can just say that I have probably more knowledge of this and more appreciation of the situation there and how it's fortunately gotten better in the last couple of years.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's interesting that you connect the two, education and what's going on with peace in that way, because I have to say one of the things that came out in my interviews with youth who were from kind of lower socioeconomic status, more than anything, was that they were happy to see the conflict end because that money that was used for war would now go to education, or that was sort of their hope, and it meant better opportunities for them.
And also, I had plenty of Colombian friends, some of whom came to the U.S. as far back as the 80s and established themselves in Miami. And then there were other people who fled. I knew people who actually had like cousins kidnapped by FARC. So I used to hear stories 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and I, could understand on a more intimate level than the average American about what the situation there was like.
Yeah, it's a fascinating situation. I think, yeah. All right, we have another hand over here.
We were just talking that I'm in high school and having said youth center, and we both use peace circles. I started using it for my classroom this year, and it's really established a tone, kind of that we're all just together, giving everybody an opportunity to speak. And it was a little awkward for me at first, and for the students, but now that we kind of established this as a space to talk, and I'm not a guidance counselor, so I wasn't really comfortable at first, but they've taken it on themselves as they actually look forward to it. And I was just thinking this week, I haven't done it in a while, I need to get back to it, to kind of bring us all back together, we're all in this together.
Yeah, and that was not something that I mentioned, but that's a great practice about peace circles. And I think there is something really powerful about the word peace, right? I mean, even in Colombia, even with that vote that I showed you, the referendum, people who voted no would still kind of say like, well, I'm not against peace, but I'm against these accords. Because, peace is something that unites and is very, in some ways uniformly positive. It can be kind of used sometimes by political forces, but I think in this case, for instance, it's a great example, having a peace circle to build unity and giving it that word, that label.
Actually, we don't use that word.
Oh, no?
No, in fact, I didn't want to call it that because I didn't want there to be an assumption that there would be conflict,
Yeah.
Just kind of, I didn't really get the label, but.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And that's, I think, one of those great lessons of being aware of your context and your situation too, and adapting it, or using it in that way. All right, do we have one more group that want to share? All right, well, keep that thinking, right? Keep those thoughts coming. So to sort of end, I want to leave you with a couple takeaways. This is my kind of sermonizing a little bit. Some of these things I think you're going to know. But sort of the hope that I wanted to express today, one is that peace and human rights education is really wide-ranging. Right? When the first time I saw those lists of 12 themes, I was like, what is the government thinking? Right? Offering 12 things that range from like the environment to history to this to that. But I think it's good because it allows for a lot of creativity and a lot of things that cross across a lot of issues. And so it's really important, I think, conceive of peace and human rights education as being very inclusive and wide-ranging. Secondly, it's happening all over the world, right? I mean, there's some great resources and great ways to connect different places across the world through peace education. And there's also some great opportunities to learn and adapt practices that are going on in other places to your own contexts. And this is the smallest little kind of window into it I've offered today, but hopefully it'll kind of make you think and open up exploring other things that people are doing in other places and countries, particularly. And then lastly, I feel silly kind of saying this to teachers, right, because this is something I think will resonate, but it's got to really be student-centered when you're talking about peace and human rights education. And one of the things that I find so often in my work that's interesting is when these programs are created, especially these policies in places like Colombia, they talk about youth and they talk about the children, but they don't go out and actually ask them, what are they thinking? How are they processing this? What's going on in their minds? And that's kind of where my work is, and that's something I really want to push, I think, is actually asking them and talking to them, what does peace mean to you? What does human rights mean to you? You do an activity with them, having them reflect on it, having it really based in what's going on in their heads to get to those kind of outcomes you want to that may be larger as they become citizens, as they become human rights activists, and all of that. Lastly, here are a couple of the resources I used. As I mentioned, this is all on a piece of paper that's in your folder, but I just wanted to highlight if you want to take another look at any of them or see some more, you have it all there listed with links. And finally, just say thank you, both to all of those who organized this wonderful event today and for all of you for your patience and time, and again, for giving up the Cubs parade in order to be here. All right. Thank you very much.